He did not want Napoleon to win because he believed that if Napoleon won, Jews would become more secular. Therefore, therefore, what role would people like Chabad have to play in that world? So,
True. It's all about job security, you know.
yeah.
Okay. Um,
He did not want Napoleon to win.
it's definitely going. Just all right, just having some issues with Facebook Messenger, but that's about it at this point.
It's all right. How's it going, Doug? I heard you were very bored at the new Napoleon movie. Your Mike.
It was a bad movie. It's not good history. It's not good film. And yeah,
Oh well, Ridley Scott had his day and it's long past. Now it's like Michael Bay instead of Ridley Scott.
it's like I think Joaquin Phoenix is a wonderful actor, but he really shouldn't have been Napoleon. Like there's this one scene where Napoleon, he's returning from Elba and he convinces the soldiers to join him. And I'm like, why would anyone follow this guy? Like there's none of Napoleon's charisma, really. He just is like this incel and almost cartoonish. And, for someone who fought, like, according to the film, 61 battles, it's like you barely see any of them. And it's like, oh, it's like they fire some cannons at the pyramids. There's a little of Austerlitz, the Toulon battle at the beginning. And the most they show is Waterloo, which, okay. But I think there's a Soviet film on Waterloo that's probably better. And it's like, if I didn't know the history, I wouldn't know what the hell was going on. It's like you didn't show his freaking Italian campaigns, and you just mess up all the history. And supposedly Ridley Scott did a 4.5 hour cut. I'm like, well, okay, it's like if I had that much bad history, I really wouldn't want more of it on screen.
Awful. God. Oh.
Like Gladiator is a historically inaccurate film, but it's actually a good film. Kingdom of Heaven, which he also did, is at least the director's cut's actually very good. I can't speak to the history because I'm not familiar with the Crusades. I'm sure it's actually probably inaccurate, but it's actually a good film. This isn't a good film or good history.
That's just unfortunate.
I was kind of also pissed they didn't have Napoleon and Jenna, but whatever. So I'm like, is there, because they'd had Talleyrand, I was hoping there would be like a Hegel cameo, but no.
That would have been really cool. I know the perfect person for him to be played by too. It would have been a knockout, but they didn't do it because they're stupid. Oh well.
I'm glad I just watched it on like a streaming thing and didn't go to the theater. You know,
mm,
like I have issues with Oppenheimer, but I actually think it's a good film. And I like Barbie, and hell, I liked Indiana Jones better than this.
The new Indiana Jones?
The new Indiana Jones, which I did see in the theater.
I haven't seen it at all. So
It's fine.
You're several up on me. uh,
It's, I don't think either, like, I think Crystal Skull is probably the worst. This is okay.
yeah.
I guess before we get started, I was going to say again, because I'll try again for talking about the problem of the sciences with philosophy. I'm going to try to reread the first chapter of this book. It's supposed to be kind of the finishing of Hawking's next book on time, where it seemed kind of going back and forth using Aristotelian versus I can't even remember at this point. It did not seem to understand the philosophy it was trying to do. It was trying to argue as a shorthand. Just
Yeah.
I think it's literally the argument of idealism versus empiricism in more fuzzy terms, even.
Yeah.
Aristotelian versus Empiricles, maybe? I don't remember.
So, so to kind of set the stage of what we're talking about tonight, I'm just going to read a couple of things just to get things going. That's okay with you guys. So, I'm just reading out of the EL. Just follow along with me. It's real short. So, quantity is pure being in which determinacy is no longer posited as one with being itself, but as sublated or indifferent. And then he says, to begin with, in its immediate relation to itself, or in the determination of self-equivalence posited by attraction, quantity is continuous magnitude. In the other determination, which it contains, that of the one, it is discrete magnitude. Those are the two, okay? But continuous quantity is also discrete, for it is only continuity of the many, and discrete quantity is also continuous, for its continuity is the one as that in which the many ones are the same, unity. Okay, so that those are the only two entries of quantity, but there's a lot more than that. Science of logic really gets into the nitty gritty of something that we are not going to be familiar with at all, and it's this. Quantity is made up of attraction, repulsion, and the one. And basically the one in its repulsion and the one in its attraction. And under quantity, the moments are called, help me out here, Kyle, discreteness and
Continuity.
and continuity. Okay. And what this means is something completely foreign to our thinking, because whenever we went to math class, you're taught the operations, you're taught to start reading numbers and how numbers are related to each other, quadratic equations, algebra, basic addition, math, subtraction, multiplication, and so you learn to use the numbers, but how quantity itself is constituted necessarily by well, basically in its logical necessity, it's something almost none of us are taught, even at the basic level. And what this boils down to is at the end of quality, yeah, you have the one and the many, and the repulsion and subsequent attraction generates a situation in which these moments, when they're sublated, are no longer purely qualitative. Okay, and that's pretty much straight out of the textbook. Now, what this means is that we graduate, we are elevated to a level in which whatever it is you're talking about, whether it's a camera, a speaker, a coffee cup, a book, right? It is what it is in its being, and you can fully talk about it in its quality. But when you start to talk about the one being either discrete or continuous sublated, you are talking about numbers of books, numbers of coffee cups, and so forth. And Hegel in his, well, I'm not sure if it's Hegel or not. Yeah, he talks about this a little. He says magnitude is not an apt expression for quantity, and it's not, insofar as it especially designates determinate quantity. Right now, we're not talking about determinate quantity yet, right? That's the second step. We are at the immediate step, the very first, in which we have what could be best termed as indeterminate quantity, although I don't think he exactly puts that way word for word. In mathematics, magnitude is usually defined as what can be increased or decreased. This definition is faulty since it still contains what is to be defined, but it does at least imply that the determination of magnitude is such that it is posited as alterable and indifferent, so that notwithstanding a change of this determination, the thing in question, for instance, a house or red, could not cease to be a house or red, right? And he says the absolute is pure quantity. This standpoint coincides in general with the attribution of the determination of matter to the absolute, in which it is true form would be present, but only as an indifferent determination. Blah blah blah. If it is grasped, blah, yeah, and so so there, he's starting to talking about counting things and whatnot, but we're not quite there yet. We're in an indeterminate space in which basically everything is well, we're just talking about the being of quantity. What it, and it sounds quite mystical, but anyway, the long and the short of it is being is made up of the one of, and I'm repeating myself here, I already said the one of attraction and the one of repulsion. And what this boils down to in the reading, let's see here. Okay, this is Holgate. He says, if, however, continuity and discreteness are to be explicitly distinct moments of quantity, the former cannot simply contain the latter, but must also stand in contrast to it. That in turn means that quantity cannot just be continuous in being discrete, but must also be continuous rather than discrete. Such overtly one-sided quantity Hegel calls continuous magnitude. And there's also a discrete magnitude. Equally, discreteness cannot simply be a moment absorbed in the continuity of quantity. It too must stand in contrast to quantity or continuity, and so constitute quantity governed by discreteness rather than continuity. So basically, if you think of quantity and its immediateness as a ball, and inside the ball you have two determinations, and if this sounds familiar, you're paying attention. One of the moments is well, I mean, exactly what the reading said, about continuous magnitude, right? It's continuous, and the other is discrete magnitude. And basically, both determinations in their unity as moments pass over into each other, very much like being and nothing. Only being and nothing only generate, as we know, becoming. So what do the being and nothing of quantity generate, right? And I think that's quantum. Is that right, Kyle?
Sorry, I kind of lost track of it. What becomes quantum again?
Okay, you know how being and nothing generate becoming, which generates just determinate being. So if the unity of discrete and continuous magnitude pass over into each other, what do they generate?
Quantum, yeah, right.
Is my question, and I think it's quantum, because quantum is the determinate being of quantity. Just to use an analog. And what that implies to me is that there's I'm not going to call it a mechanical, but there's a mechanical action that takes place in immediate quantity, which makes quantum necessary. In other words, to operate with quantity in its full flowering, you would need quantums, right? Numbers with which to count, and so on and so forth. They're necessary for quantity as both a continuous and discrete state of being to count for something. Otherwise, they just remain latent, which they're not latent. They describe what happens with numbers, as we know, but that's working backwards from Hegel's order. Hegel's order is to show the logical necessity, and so we're basically working from the other end, so to speak. Remark one, he talks about the conception of pure quantity, and he gives Spinoza a lot of credit. He says, it is the notion of pure quantity as opposed to the mere image of it that Spinoza, for whom it had a special importance, has in mind when he speaks of quantity. And Houlgate claims that he gives Spinoza too much credit, but I couldn't follow his entire thought on that point. Something along the lines of Spinoza not anyway, that's kind of in the weeds. Let's see what does Houlgate say here. He says the self-relating being or immediacy that they constitute, in which they and the one, the highest manifestation of quality, are moments, is thus identified by Hegel as quantity, or rather, quantity is the name he gives to this logical structure that is no longer qualitative. And that's an important point to keep in mind. He's not taking quantity as such and then sort of reading qualitative things into it. He's going in logical order. And so quantity doesn't exist until it is generated by the concepts just discussed. And those were qualitative concepts before they were sublated. Once they were sublated, they made up the structure of quantity and generated the concept of quantity itself and its immediacy. Before then, it didn't exist as far as our logical argument is concerned. Yeah, I'm going to stop talking. Kyle, Doug, Jim, your thoughts, anything that stood out to you? This is a very different animal because, we're just sort of taught to think of quantity and see numbers, and away we go with the concrete numbers as opposed to.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think that there's any sort of usefulness, because in a way, because remember, for example, attraction then not only is kind of, parallel, I guess it's kind of referenced by, presupposed by repulsion, but which itself has attraction as a moment inside that. It almost feels like it's a reflection that comes back around. Is that a real thing to feel, or is that just sort of kind of
my very amateur impression is this: repulsion, attraction, and the one, when they are still within quality, are, think of them as several cogs turning against each other, and they're moving, they're having action in the same way that, say, being and nothing became becoming, became determinate being. That's a very general statement, by the way. I'm not making them parallel the way that Hegel does, because I'm not very familiar with this. I'm just saying that there are ways to talk about repulsion and attraction in the one within quality that are not commensurate with how you talk about them as moments of quantity. Once you turn over into quantity, their articulation as immediate quantity and what they do to generate quantum are different, and you can't think of them in the same way. And I think that is why he gives them different names. He turns over and calls repulsion and attraction discreteness and continuity, because those are the shapes. They're the same shapes, right? But they've basically changed their spots, and they're looking to generate in unity what separately they generated very differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, although I think my questions, I guess that's meaning when I meant that, I meant the higher level stuff. So it's like, how does continuity, it almost as does this continuity through to discreteness come back upon itself? And that is that the way it's the moment of, I think that's
Right.
because it's a continuity of discreteness, so it kind of has to
I pictured a
back
number
upon
line
itself.
in my head, and it may be inaccurate, but I pictured a number line from 1 to 100. And I said, here's a set 1 to 100, whereby the counting of 1 plus 1 plus 1 is continuous. Each member of that continuous set is a discrete number, and you wouldn't have the continuity without the discrete numbers, and you wouldn't have the dis you get what I'm saying. They, they both uh, blend like a zipper. You know, they pass over into each other.
You have differences and similarities are important to categorization. Yeah.
Yeah, it's another one of those things where we haven't gotten to essence yet, where we can talk about positive and negative as absolutely coextensive. At this stage in the logic, we can't say that categories are coextensive. Well, no, we can. We can. Being and nothing prove that. They're absolutely coextensive and practically the same as each other. And you know, as we elevate, it gets more complicated. But even though we're not in essence, all of the categories that are sort of opposed or antinomies, almost the discreteness and the continuity, for example, turn out to determine each other. I forget which order it is, but you can't have one without the other. But that's the way it turns out to be, right? When examining being. And I think that was part of Hegel's point, was that, okay, well, it turns out that you can't have one without the other. Yeah, so I used the number line in my head to just sort of put it in a because he doesn't give a whole lot in terms of example, and I think well, okay, the next section we're going into 199 is continuous and discrete magnitude, and I mean, it's only a couple pages, but then he gets to the limitation of quantity. Yeah, quantity is a very short chapter. I almost think we should have just finished it to quantum, but I didn't realize it was that quick. Here, let me read this because this sounds interesting. It says the usual separation of the magnitudes, unless anyone wants to pipe in with anything real quick. Doug, you good? Jim? Okay. In the usual ideas of continuous and discrete magnitude, it is overlooked that each of these magnitudes contains both moments, continuity and discreteness, and that the distinction between them consists only in this, that in one of the moments the determinateness is posited, and in the other it is only implicit. Space, time, and matter, and so forth are continuous magnitudes in that they are repulsions from themselves, a streaming forth out of themselves, which at the same time is not their transition or relating of themselves to a qualitative other. They possess the absolute possibility that the one may be posited in them at any point, not the empty possibility of a mere otherness. But they contain the principle of the one within themselves. It is one of the determinations which constitutes them. Conversely, in discrete magnitude, continuity is not to be overlooked. This moment is, as has been showed, the one as unity. Continuous and discrete magnitude can be regarded as species of quantity, provided that magnitude is posited. not under any external determinateness, but under the determinateness of its own moments. What this means, basically, that last sentence, is that he's not, the logical necessity doesn't come from looking at external objects and counting them and saying, okay, this is how it works, because that's how it's usually taught. He's saying that it's their internal moments, i.e., the continuous and discrete magnitudes that are generated out of repulsion and attraction in the one under quality, are the moments that determine what quantity becomes. Okay, which is basically to say, only use what is behind you in determinations, not an external, something that you're sort of like begging the question. The ordinary transition from genus to species allows external characteristics to be attributed to the former according to some external basis of classification. That's exactly what I said. And besides, continuous and discrete magnitude are not yet quanta. They are only quantity itself in each of its two forms. They are perhaps called magnitudes insofar as they have in common with quantum simply this, to be a determination in quantity. So what we're really talking about, if we flipped Hegel on it from his head back onto his feet, all right, and went in historical order, we're used to looking at numbers, quantities of things, cows, computers, all that stuff. And then we start to talk about the numberness of 50 computers. And what do you say about it, right? Well, some of the things that you talk about when you're talking about that are the continuity and discreteness involved in that quantity. And that's what we're building up right now, coming out of quality. It sounds very foreign, but if you were actually to like be asked about a quantity of something and you wanted to be, extra pedantic about it, you would have to talk about the magnitude that's discrete, like each and every one of the computers in your stock, your stock room if you're selling the computers, and as well as, say, the continuous flow of the computers as they are made off of the production line, right? And when I say that, I'm just saying the general categories of like, those are moments of your production line and your distribution line, right? And you can't talk about those without discrete magnitude and continuous magnitude. The end. Yeah. So, let's see here. Interesting. The last page, 201, it says, discrete magnitude has first the one for its principle. Secondly, it is a plurality of ones. And thirdly, it is essentially continuous. It is the one as at the same time sublated as unity, the continuation of itself as such in the discreteness of the ones. Like you never go anywhere continuous unless they're made up of ones and so forth. Consequently, it is posited as one magnitude, the determinateness of which is the one, which in this posited and determinate being is the excluding one, a limit in the unity. Discrete magnitude as such is immediately not limited, but is distinguished from continuous magnitude. It is a determinate being, a something with the one as its determinateness and also as its first negation and limit. So at the very beginning, immediate quantity was first and foremost in its immediate shape, a continuous magnitude. That was the posited version, the form of quantity in its immediateness. If you wanted to talk about the discreteness, it was implied. You can talk about the implied discreteness as related to the other moment, but it remains implied until it's posited. And here at the very end on 201, he's saying once you're done talking about it, you run up against the limit of immediate quantity and run into the discrete magnitude, which has a limit, and it's the first negation. This limit, and I'm just going to read to the end because we're kind of connecting this up and going somewhere with it. This limit, which is related to the unity and is the negation in it, is also as the one self-related. It is thus the enclosing, encompassing limit. Limit here is not at first distinguished from its determinate being as something, but as the one is immediately this negative point itself. But the being which here is limited is essentially a continuity by virtue of which it passes beyond the limit, beyond this one to which it is indifferent. Real discrete quantity is thus a quantity or quantum quantity as a determinate being and something. Since the one which is a limit includes within itself the many ones of discrete quantity, it equally posits them as sublated within it. And because it is a limit of continuity simply as such, the distinction between continuous and discrete magnitude is here of no significance, or more correctly, it is a limit to the continuity of the one as much as of the other. Both undergo transition into quanta. So basically, on the next page, he says quantum is quantity with the determinateness or limit in general is in its complete determinateness number, right? This is where we get to number, if you recall from our EL reading. So before that, we're just describing sort of the sub basement floor of number, like what does number consist of immediately before it is actually number, if I can put it that way. That's very badly put. Quantum differentiates itself, secondly, into extensive quantum, in which the limit is a limitation of the determinately existing plurality, and B, intensive quantum or degree, the determinate being having made the transition into being for self. Intensive quantum, as both for itself and at the same time immediately outside itself, has its determinateness in another. As this manifest contradiction of being determined simply within itself, yet having its determinateness outside it, pointing outside itself for it, quantum posited as being in its own self, external to itself, passes over thirdly into quantitative infinity. And quantitative infinity is what we're really how should I say it? We're really familiar with this concept. It's like the number line, 1 to 100, 1 to 1000, 1 to infinity, exactly as he says. They could go on forever. Qualitatively, I think this is parallel to the so-called bad infinity in quality, only this is the quantitative version in which numbers go on forever into infinitesimals that never end. Yeah, number. Quantity is quantum or has a limit, both as continuous and as discrete magnitude. The difference between these two kinds has here in the first instance no immediate significance. So here we see, just to cap off what I'm talking about here, when you get to number, whereas in immediate being, quantity consists first and foremost only in a posited continuous magnitude, right? Which doesn't even add up to a number, a quantum, right? Yet. Here we can see continuous as well as discrete magnitude a lot more in focus. I can't remember, I haven't read this far yet, but I can't remember if they're equal yet. They might not be equal yet. They might actually be equal under ratio or something to do with that. With that, I'm going to stop. What do you think, Kyle? Doug, Jim? we've sort of passed over into quantum without meaning to.
But yeah.
That's not bad though, because quantum is going to take us quite a bit, and this is probably your area. Once we get to it, that's probably for next time, Kyle. Unless you want more time, and we can, I can give you more time to like look at it and give us, I don't know.
No, I guess I can start looking ahead. I didn't see all the calculus stuff, so all the excursions.
And if nothing else, we can still use the EL to sort of cruise through it, and get beyond it. I've given up trying to be a teacher of this stuff, because even though we've all gone through the EL, I think I passed the ability to teach this to someone else intelligibly, somewhere around being for self. Unfortunately, I'm still wrestling with the third determination of quality, and how that sort of like works. I don't know. Has anyone had a chance to look at that and have a little bit more of a, I don't know, a better God's eye view than me on that? What was it? The end of it, the end of being for self is repulsion and attraction, and their dual action. And before that is the one in the many, and the one in the many generating the repulsion and attraction. And the one is generated by, and this was before this, what is this? Idealism. The finite, I think it's the finite and the infinite. Is that right? Yeah, it's the finite and the infinite that make the one. Something like that.
Yeah, it makes true infinity, when true infinity makes, yeah.
Yeah. And so you have this catalog of moments that pass over into unities with each other, from being and nothing all the way up through where we are. And those unities act like, in normal conversation, they act almost like black boxes. We don't really know why or how repulsion and attraction do it like that, but Hegel has given it a name in each of the unities, and tried to give us a good logical argument for how they work inside that black box. He's trying to give us the schematics for each black box of transition, because they are the hardest arguments to make. They're what hang the entire logical system of arguments together. And I would argue without those, I mean, what's the point? You're trying to defeat Kant's antinomies and the idea that the black boxes shouldn't be opened, and he's not too interested in opening them regardless. He just knows they work. Whereas Hegel says, no, we can know, reason can know what's going on in there. And here I'm going to take a stab at describing it for you. And that's your passage from dualism to monism. Idealist monism, so called, but I would argue that the absolute idealism that he coined here is such that, I mean, when we get into Marx always talks about, well, in the well-known quote, that he turned Hegel from his head back onto his feet. When he did that, he wasn't looking to separate the ideal from the material, but simply change the perspective. The ideal has to come with the material, or Spinoza's aphorism about the order of things and ideas. I mean, it doesn't mean a thing if you don't take the ideal with the material in your analysis. And Marx's, just trying to finish the thought, Marx's articulation in Capital bears this out. The entire first chapter is all ideal, all concept. He's building up the concept of the commodity as a concept, as an ideal concept, in order to build up what it's actually, what the determination is supposed to look like before it is set loose in a concrete world, which turns out actually to just be the ideal side. When he's building up all the models of the capital circuits in words, right? He's not talking about a specific singular factory system. He's talking about the universal factory system, boiled down to its conceptual articulation, which again is still ideal. But it reflects the material world in such a way that it brings out, I mean, what eventually turns out by necessity to be the class system that operates it. And I'll leave it there. God, that was a lot. How the fuck did I do that? I did that with no notes. That complete mystery.
I think it was Lenin who had said that. I think in his philosophical notebooks, he made a comment that really there's not that much difference between Hegel's absolute idealism and dialectical materialism. They're almost the same thing, almost.
Well, I would argue that they are the same thing. You're just looking at it from the material perspective in order to do something about the material world. Whereas Hegel was trying to reform philosophy to make it, what's the word, relevant in a world of scholastic logics in school that you're just supposed to learn and then go on and be useful to the world. So, I mean, if you really want Hegel, without Hegel, there would be no Marx. There's no double-breaded sandwich of ideal and material to turn over, right? There's just the one-sidedness, and the one-sidedness would never work. That was one of the problems with Feuerbach. He said everything needs to be turned over, and you just retain the material. And of course, there's a problem with that. You know, you leave out one side and not the other. And then you look at all the people throughout the 19th century that Marx and Engels critically examined, the German idealists, and you notice that they've all, to one degree or the other, erred more on the materialist side or the idealist side, but never had both pieces of bread intact in their own systems. Something like that. I would have to reread the Holy Family and German ideology to give you the actual examples, which I'm sure Doug has all stuffed in his head right now, or maybe not. You've since written 2 books since we've read those, so I'm pretty sure a lot of that information has sort of like been dumped a little bit. Anyway. Crickets.
Yeah.
It's okay. Okay, well, I thought I would be talking about a lot of nothing tonight, honestly, and it turns out that there was a lot to talk about. But yeah, the biggest thing I wanted to get across is quantity in its immediate form is more related to the end of quality than the numbers that are generated necessarily later. But without this articulation, there would be no numbers, there would be no quantum. And in making that argument is specious because in the order Hegel is going, Marx is right to say that history and the natural world generate the world of ideas and all of the logical necessity. Hegel does not, I know I've said this before, Hegel does not deny that history and space, time, and matter generates all the rest of it in the ideal world. But that's not his point. The logical necessity is proved by going in this order. And it's difficult to read because going in this order has no analog today, except maybe if you go and read Marx's Capital, you see an articulation of the presentation. Or if you read the Phenomenology and talk about consciousness, he goes in the same direction with that applied. But if you're not familiar with that kind of argumentation, which unfortunately we live in a non-philosophical nightmare, you know, it takes some training. Did all that make sense?
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I think I still need to. I almost feel like I need to go back and review this off tonight a few things, especially since I didn't get as far as the continuous and the rest of the chapter.
To be honest, Kyle, the first time I started looking at it was yesterday, and I didn't spend all that much time. Half of my reciting some of it today is the first time that I've read some of these paragraphs. And in general, all I'm doing is going in the logical order that he and Houlgate more clearly write out. Here's this element, here's this element. This is what these elements do to each other in quality, and this is what they generate. Once it generates quantity, they act in unity as sublated moments. And as moments in unity, they affect each other. They pass over into each other, right? And when they articulate themselves as moments, as opposed to separate elements in quality, they tend to accentuate the other half of themselves in the unity. And in doing so, it generates it determinates the determinate being of quantity, which is the quantum, which is the number. The number consists of being discrete as well as continuous magnitude. As far as your ability to describe a number, both of those are in that determination. Like any number you can think of, 1, 100, whatever, right? You look at the number as a concept, the quantum as a concept, and you find you cannot talk about it without talking about the number alone and the number within a set and so forth. They both come as a package, and depending on what you're looking at in the operation of the numbers, one or the other or both come out explicitly. Does that make sense? Oh, okay. So yeah, half of my presentation here is basically teaching myself as well how this works. And I don't have it like the back of my hand. I'm just sort of like working it through by talking about it.
Yep.
Now I guess I know how being a what do you call those guys? You know, you work for the professor, you make next to nothing, you teach 6 classes a day, and you live in a trailer park.
Teaching assistant. Or,
Yes, a TA. Thank you. Now I know what being a TA feels like. And notate bene. In his first year, this is in the new biography. In his first year at Jena, was it Jena? Yeah, I think it was Jena. He was given a class in logic. He taught a class in logic and metaphysics, and his initial articles, The Different Shrift, and later Faith and Reason, reflect his working out the eventual unification of both logic and metaphysics. Because before they were separate, they could be taught as separate disciplines. And in his first class, I'm pretty sure he showed that distinction. By the time he gets to Nuremberg and founds the gymnasium and gives classes and assigned classes to lots of teachers in the elementary high school system and so forth, metaphysics and logic are basically just a philosophy class in which they're fused, in which both his Jena system as well as actually no, that was after phenomenology of logic or phenomenology of spirit. So he has a decently defined sense of being, essence, and concept already worked out. It's just all the details hadn't been written down. It took him a decade to do this. So, and I know Doug finished. Jim, I highly recommend you take a look at this when you get the time. I know you've got it, Kyle. This has excellent descriptions that connect the early picture of philosophy that he came up against in Tübingen and then Jena, especially Jena, and why he went the directions that he did. The outlines were developed first, and then he filled them out with the content. And the idea of hanging them all together with logical arguments showing the necessity of every one. I mean, he sort of charted his course between, what was it? Where was he? I think he'd already charted his course while he was in Frankfurt, and then when he got to Jena, I mean, the matchbook exploded because suddenly he's in contact with everybody day to day in Jena and able to work out his ideas. And he had time for card playing, drinking lots of fine wine, and women. I mean, one of the things I've been talking with our comrade Ben Hillen about is that, after getting this far in the biography, like Marx, going down to the pub, Hegel is someone that you would be happy to spend an evening with just playing cards, You can't say that about Schopenhauer. Man, you talk about a sour man. Oh.
He was rather a nasty person in his personal life. I think he once got mad at a maid and threw her down the stairs. He injured her, and he had to pay out. And then when she died, he no longer had to pay her. He wrote in his diary, he was happy, but he no longer had to pay her.
And in contrast, Hegel, who has a child with his landlady in Jena before he was married, right? He ends up taking care of her. He ends up helping to take care of his sister for a period when they're in Nuremberg before she moves away again, and so on and so forth. I mean, he looks after people. You read the descriptions from all the people who were students at the gymnasium or worked with him. I mean, they all had glowing reports. This was a gentle, patient man, as a schoolmaster, as a teacher, as even a statesman, right? Well, I say statesman, but really, he remained a German revolutionary as much as he could without being picked up by the secret police. And I think he was very aware of this danger because, I mean, he watched his sister's friends group get picked off by the secret police one by one. So he was very aware of the danger. So as much of a revolutionary as he could be in that situation, he remains so. Kind of a tightrope walk, really. In later descriptions in Berlin, de Hondt's biography of him talks about how his teaching assistants were hounded by the police since they didn't really have any real power the way Hegel did. And Hegel didn't really have that much power, but they went after his teaching assistants to harass the teaching of Hegel's philosophy at Berlin. So, you know, he almost moved away to Paris, as I recall. He would not move to Amsterdam. I don't know why, but it said that he was given an invitation from a colleague either in Jena or Tübingen, I forget which one, to come to the Netherlands, and he wouldn't do it. Probably had to do with his fiance and wife later. But I'm kind of running out of steam on talking about this.
Managed to find a lot of steam. So
You know, yeah, quantity by itself, there's only so much to talk about,
right.
which, you know, is great.
It is the ground. The whole chapter. Yeah. No.
It's funny you say that because when I read that sentence early on that said that oh, I forget which one it is, something about a retreat into the ground. I at first looked behind me because that's the way I think in these arguments. But the fact is that the real ground is the absolute, which generates all the rest of it. But you don't know that yet. So when you retreat into the ground, you're really retreating into being completely fulfilled as the absolute. Because that's ultimately, where object scientifically becomes subject in the concept, is how it's supposed to work. And in saying that, it sounds like a religious incantation. If you put together a summary like I did earlier, Houlgate has the great quote that sort of summarizes that. I think it was Houlgate, or maybe it was Hegel, I forget. But I posted it, and it says, no. This is Klaus Viehweg, the biographer, and he says, so the foundations of the science of logic. He says, logic is the science of the one idea in and for itself, a new metaphysics as a foundational philosophical discipline. The philosophy of nature represents the idea in its otherness, while the philosophy of Geist represents the idea that returns to itself from otherness, which is also known as externality. The idealistic monism of freedom is the alpha and omega of philosophy of science, of reason, and freedom. The concept is that which determines itself in itself freely. So if you think about what this means, if you just look at it from a God's eye view, you're thinking of, if you look at it from the singular viewpoint, me, I'm looking outside myself and I am, right? And then I pass over into nature externally and I interact with it as myself. And then I take in the information that is myself and the world outside of me and return into myself, into my Geist, right? Which is a combination of my being as well as what's around me, right? That is when you process nature and yourself together, right? In the space of spirit. And spirit becomes, me plus nature. I'm returning into myself from otherness. In other words, the world outside me, and so forth. And that's basically a system. And so when he talks about aesthetics, like art, he frequented many places of art and people's collections in Nuremberg, especially, where he developed his aesthetics. His entire theory of aesthetics is based on the idea that you are you, and you take in what's outside of you and you come back in and you reason it, put it together. And I'm really generalizing here because you know, I haven't read the lectures on aesthetics, so I can't tell you any specifics. I'm just sort of like I'm guessing that, that's what it says. But if it follows a system, that's basically what it is. You have your being, and then you have what's external to you, and then you return it, you know, into your head as Geist, and you generate culture, and so on and so forth. I'm just going to look in this, the philosophy of mind. You know, am I right? I'm not sure. Let me look at the table of contents. What does he talk about? Sorry. So subjective mind, physical soul, the feeling soul, the actual soul. That's anthropology. Subsection B, phenomenology of mind, consciousness, proper self-consciousness and reason. Sounds a lot like the phenomenology of spirit, right? Only this shows the logical necessity within those determinations that is at variance with the latter to reason, I want to say. And then you go on to psychology and mind. And then section 2 is mind objective, law, the morality of conscience, the moral life or social ethics. And then section 3 is absolute mind. And the subsections there are exactly as the biographer says. Subsection A, art, subsection B, religion, and subsection 3, philosophy. So, in other words, culture. An absolute mind, we generate culture out of our experiences in the real world, is kind of what he's getting at. And so there's Hegel's system, talking about what's in thought, what's outside us in nature and otherwise, and what we do with it when we come back to ourselves. We generate culture and so forth. That's my Hegel 101 for anyone watching. And of course, y'all. Does any of that make any of this clearer? Kind of where Hegel is going with some of this?
Well,
Yeah. Yeah, right.
I've come to the conclusion that if you're going to teach Hegel, you cannot neglect to talk about his entire system before you start plowing through the logic. Otherwise, it just looks like, what are we doing here? But once you get that down, or at least a general picture of what he wants to animate in its entire logical necessity, suddenly immediate quantity doesn't seem like such a trivial thing. Because without knowing the full articulation of immediate quantity, how are you going to get to number and talk about it intelligently? I mean, you can, but like the shapes of consciousness that insist that you stick with feeling and you stick with the understanding, you're going to be sort of taking your environment in as it is for granted, rather than being able to explain it all and just saying, well, we can't understand everything. And so, you know, we do the best we can with what we have and leave it at that. And, you know, and that's the limit of understanding. That's the limit of representation, picture thinking, and so forth, which he pretty thoroughly demolished as a basis for speculative philosophy in the phenomenology. Hell, he even knocked over miracles. I love that. If you read deep enough into the phenomenology, like Spinoza, he demolishes miracles and the basis of like revealed religion, revelation. That's the word. He demolishes revelation as a basis for sound reasoning in the phenomenology, and then moves on into any of the other stuff.
so as system building is concerned, it seems that Hegel got much farther than David Hume and Adam Smith ever got. Remember, Smith and Hume had a very close personal and intellectual relationship, and the way it worked was Hume was laying out what he called a science of man. He was trying to in his writings he was laying out the general outline of the system, with the idea that Adam Smith would fill in all the details. And Smith, when Smith embarked on his career as a professor, he intended to write a whole series of treatises on subjects of political economy, moral philosophy, psychology, aesthetics, so forth. But all he was ever able to complete was his treatise on political economy, which the Wealth of Nations, and his treatise the moral theory, the moral sentiments. And that's as far as he got.
Yeah.
And very, very, very much to his own frustration and consternation.
And
Because Hegel seems to have gotten much farther in terms of filling out his system.
yeah, which is probably why Marx took Hegel's elements of philosophy of right much more seriously than Adam Smith's. And Adam Smith's, yeah, have a good night, Doug. Take care. Adam Smith's, like, you read Capital, and he spends an awful lot of time on. This is my last thought, and then we'll go to last thoughts. So with the two of you for the YouTube broadcast, but everyone who reads Capital, you get the distinct impression that Adam Smith is far more important than, say, Hegel. But the fact is that if you want to go in the order of importance, I think Hegel's speculative reason is why he could go and critique Adam Smith with such facility, because Adam Smith was one of the last bourgeois sources of trying to get a hold of political economy at the transition from feudalism to capitalism, whereas Hegel and his philosophy of right was able to separate civil society from the state. And that, I think, brought the ability to handle political economy, up a level, up a big level, actually. I don't know. I haven't read Wealth of Nations past a couple of pages, so I don't know enough to compare the two. But that would be an interesting study. Someone reads The Wealth of Nations and then reads the elements of the philosophy of right, and then reads Capital and says, okay, well, here's what he's doing, and here's how it's articulated. I'm sure someone's written a thesis like that, something like that. Jim, have you ever seen anything like that?
Well, I've read that Hegel did write about Smith, so.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I think he did do some political economy studies.
Yeah.
But they don't survive. I think they were thrown away by the first biographer, or I don't know, they just got lost. Who knows? Anyway, it's 10:08. Final thoughts? All right, then I'm going to suggest that what should we do? All right, before we move on to quantum, I really think we should spend the next time discussing remark 2 from page 190 to 190, whatever it is, 199. I didn't get into it because Hegel's wrestling with Kant is like a 2-chapter affair in the commentary from Houlgate, for one thing. For another, I don't think we should pass over it in silence and just go on to quantum, because I mean, we've already done that with the EL. I really just want to get as many angles of this as we can, even if it's just superficially. So I'm going to suggest that we reread or read for the first time, whichever it is, remark 2 on Kant and the antinomies, and then come back and discuss them next week. How does that sound? Okay, and that gives you 2 weeks, Kyle, to basically look at quantum and say, okay, well, here's the mathematics to do with it, and maybe you'll have something to say about. I mean, it's over 100 pages, so it's not like we're going to tackle it all in one session. We could if we wanted, but that's a lot of reading for like one session, even if it's just reading and like talking about it. Sound good? So next time, Kant and the antinomies and Hegel's critique. And we'll leave it there. Have a great night, comrades.
Evening.